Thank you so much for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together each day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and to discuss important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, and this week on Connect and Collaborate, we're focusing on tax and fiscal issues that are impacting business in Colorado and also on the national level. Today, my guest is Carol Hedges. Carol Hedges. She's the Executive Director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute. Carol, thanks so much for joining us.
Tammy, it's just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, you've got a lot of perspectives to share with us today. You were kind of saying what we can do here in Colorado to have a path toward prosperity. Where do we start?
Well, I think the place we need to start is to think not in the immediate, but in the longer term. I think we've been in a situation where we have been really constraining the public investments that we've made at the sacrifice, really, of sort of planning for and being able to deal with the growth that we're currently experiencing.
Okay, and lay that out for me a little more.
So in Colorado, we haven't, let me just take one of the big
Please
issues
do.
That's facing the state right now, and that's transportation.
Yes.
You know, whether you're here in your business interests are moving your goods and services across the state, or whether it's when you're at home on the weekend and you're trying to get up to the mountains and ski, we're seeing increasing congestion in our highway system, and we're just not moving people around in a terribly effective way these days. Part of that is that we haven't really had an infusion of additional dollars for transportation in the state of Colorado since 1999. Since that period of time, congestion on our roads has gone up 280%, but we've only increased our budget for the Department of Transportation by about 32%.
Well, and they've said they basically have a budget where they can only maintain. And when you mention that, it's however the tax base worked out that there's a number of factors that, you know, there was a gas tax to help pay for roads, but now the cars are more efficient. You're not getting as much tax revenue at the gas pump, so that's one factor.
And that's a really important factor. We've got policy decisions working against one another, and many of those.
Well, yeah, and those decisions were made, like you said, the 90s.
Right. Well, and they're being made in Washington, and they're affecting us differently. Not only are cars are more efficient, but we've also got we have the problem that what it costs now for steel and concrete is dramatically increased over where it was in 1999, and when we last raised our gasoline tax. And quite frankly, that's one of the issues that we just, as a state, haven't been able to come to grips with.
Well, and that's a figure I think Abby Borchers gave me when we were talking about the impact of marijuana and the monies that we were expecting for transportation or whatever for that, saying a couple $1 million doesn't go very far when you're building a road.
Oh, that's right. I mean, unfortunately, it's a couple $1 million seems like a lot of money to you and me.
Exactly.
But when you're actually trying to put even a widening a highway or putting on more safe shoulders or access rights, you burn $1 million in a really short period of time.
Yeah, in maybe a mile.
Yep. That used to be the old numbers. I don't remember exactly.
I'm sorry. I wish I could access the actual quote right now, but yeah, it just doesn't go as far as you'd like to think. What other challenges besides transportation?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that the state is facing in financing now is our education system. Whether that really extends from early childhood education all the way through higher ed. If we had just kept up with inflation in spending per pupil since 2000, we would be investing about $800 million more a year in our public education system. Wow. And the thing that's really challenging about that, Tammy, is that if you're high-income students, wealthy families, our kids are doing really well. We score really well on tests. Those kids do really well. But that's a very small percentage of the kids overall.
Right.
We have one of the largest gaps between attainment for kids at both reading and math in elementary school among kids who come from low-income homes. that's just potential we have that we're just not taking advantage of.
Really?
And it's not as if we don't have the resources. We have one of the best economies in the country. Things are growing like gangbusters around here. Making those kinds of investments in our kids and in our future are just opportunities we're not taking advantage of.
Where do we identify those gaps? Is it, if you're talking about lower income students, is it different distractions at home that keep them from excelling at school, or are we talking about other financial gaps?
Well, I think that every kid is unique, right? We have to remember that we don't all start on the same step on the ladder when we walk into a classroom. But we finance education as if every kid is on the same step on the ladder. And so we have to think not only about the number of dollars, but the structure of how we finance and provide for kids. One of the real characteristics of how well a kid is going to do in school is how many words they had in their vocabulary when they come into
when they
classroom.
came into kindergarten, maybe.
Right. So let's start thinking about that, and not every kid, because maybe a mom isn't present as much because she's working more. Whatever the reason is, those are very normal and natural things that are happening in households across the state. Well, let's recognize that and invest in that kid so that they can catch up with their vocabulary. It's possible to do. We can see it happening, but it takes resources because it takes more one-on-one attention that we just don't have the resources. We aren't devoting the resources to. It's not that we don't have them, it's that we aren't devoting them.
I hate to guess, but are we devoting some of those resources into like constant test preparation?
Well, I'm going to stay agnostic on testing. I mean, I think it's really important that we remember about testing is the idea is to make sure that kids are actually accomplishing what we need them to accomplish, that the system of public education is serving them well. That's the idea behind testing. Now, somewhere along the line, we decided that we would punish teachers and schools if their kids didn't perform well, but we forgot that what would help those teachers and schools if they had the resources that they needed.
Yeah.
So, there's a big, healthy debate about testing. I think that, from my perspective, it is more about, do we have the resources that that teachers and educators, the professionals in our classrooms, in our schools, need in order to get those kids what they need in order to be productive members and work for people, be good employees.
Yeah, and I would imagine a lot of that is the time to focus on the kids to teach them, the vocabulary, the math equations, all of it.
It's time, it's alternative approaches, it's the ability to recognize that one kid learns in one way and one kid learns in another. I know that I have 2 children, and each of them have a strength in the way they acquire their knowledge. And if you're looking at a classroom of 35 kids, I don't care how much of a super teacher you are, if you don't have that, I mean, it's hard to figure that out.
You're not going to be able to specialize in each child's specific best way of learning.
And we can do that. It's possible, but again, we're just not providing the resources. The other thing I want to add to that is really challenging in Colorado right now is how resources for education, across all levels of education, vary from community to community. There are many communities in the state that don't have a lot of property wealth, and because we have so constrained resources in ways that the state can help, by tax cuts and constitutional tax code policy that we have, that our way of blending local and state taxes has really been strained over the last 20, 25 years. And that means if you live in a district that doesn't have a lot of property wealth, it's very hard for that community to generate the dollars to serve their kids well.
Right.
And that just seems a shame to me. It just seems a shame to me that your zip code for a kid should really determine the quality of education that they get.
You're right. Yeah, definitely. Great point, and I thank you for that. What about higher education?
Well, since starting, really in the late 90s, state governments across the country have been really constrained in how to finance higher education. And college is getting to be really expensive these days.
Incredible.
It's crazy. And so this isn't a phenomenon that's unique simply to Colorado, but I've looked at the data, and in Colorado, we've had to increase tuition faster than almost any other, than most states in the country.
Why is that?
Primarily because we've constrained the number of state dollars that are available to invest in K-12 education. Back in the sort of the late 90s, I think is the time, we spent about 20% of our state budget on higher education. It's now down to about 8%.
Oh.
We're squeezing that budget because we're having more demands for the state to invest in K-12 education because local governments aren't able to raise as much money. We have more and more people that are, that we're having other kinds of demands in the system, and so we're whether it's prisons or healthcare or other things, and it's squeezing the amount of money that we're investing in higher education. So back in 2000, the state, we collectively picked up about 2/3 of the cost of a college education, and then the student and family picked up about 1/3. That ratio has switched now.
Yeah.
And it is getting more and more expensive for anybody to get any kind of education after high school, even though we know that the jobs that are out there that pay the kinds of wages that can help a family be self-sufficient demand some sort of education beyond high school.
Yeah. Well, the tuition rates have really skyrocketed, and I saw it happening, in when I was like in my 30s and seeing how much they were rising. I'm like, where is it coming from? How do they keep rising? And I suspect I had a theory that if you're asking parents to save money for tuition, then all of a sudden the tuition goes up. But how's my theory to test out?
Well, I don't think it's quite that direct. I mean, I don't know that we've really been good enough. We've created policies, or we've seen savings accounts increase enough to be driving those costs.
Is that right? Really?
I think what's happening, there's a combination of a couple of things. There aren't as many public dollars going into helping offset, having the community share in those costs.
Exactly.
And quite frankly, the cost of higher ed's gone up. I mean, we're paying, we're having faculty that's, their salaries have to go up too, and
and to keep up with the technology.
Absolutely.
That's a huge expense, I'm imagining.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. What are the other key priorities that make Colorado communities get to share in that prosperity?
Well, I think that there's a couple of other things. I think in Colorado we're really committed to sort of our connection to the outdoors.
Yes.
Our physical environment is incredible. So access to parks and resources. And luckily in the state, we did something really unique in expressing our sense of values when we passed Great Outdoors Colorado, where the proceeds of the lottery in Colorado go to creating open space. And I find it a really interesting example. So many people are critical of how the public sector does things, how public investments, government investments, can make a difference for communities. Great Outdoors Colorado is a great example of public dollars. They're dollars collected by a bunch of people that are then distributed across the state.
Right.
Every county in the state, every community in the state has access to parks and all kinds of outdoor resources. So I think that's an important place that we have to stay focused. Water. It's a huge issue in the state of Colorado.
Yeah.
We haven't been investing in keeping our water retainment and containment and retention facilities up to date. And we're looking at 50 years of neglect. And we've got to figure out how we're going to help the folks who have the ability to have private dams, et cetera, to help with us, our water system, be able to do that, to contribute to the overall well-being or supporting the quality of life we all want in Colorado.
Well, and I understand that Aurora is working on like a new reservoir, and that I don't know how much that impacts other areas, but if at least they can preserve some, it has to trickle down.
Yeah, and this is a case where trickling down may actually work.
Yeah.
That you do have to have places where you can contain, because that's just our natural environment. We have water that kind of flows through, and we have to be able to grab it. But I think water quality, air quality are other places that where we haven't been able to stay. We've made great progress in this state, But until those are the kinds of things that are really going to lead to economic prosperity here, or to maintain economic prosperity here.
Thank you, Carol. Great perspectives. Let's talk a little bit more about, as we continue our focus on tax and fiscal issues here in Colorado. What's your opinion on tax credits and what the state is doing to maybe incentivize some businesses? I know you have some strong opinions.
Well, we have the Colorado Fiscal Institute. Our objective, what we try to do every day is to work to make Colorado a place where our tax and budget policies support equity and widespread economic prosperity. And we base a lot of our work on some principles that were developed by the National Conference of State Legislatures about what make an effective revenue system. And one of the things that they lift up is that we should be very careful about picking winners and losers. And that's, one of those things that I think that is really foremost in people's minds now, particularly around the discussion of the federal tax bill.
Okay.
But that tax credits and deductions really are special treatment, right?
Okay.
They're exceptions to the general rule. And I think that it's important that that the legislature, who has a lot of authority to make these decisions, think about it in that way, that they are creating special exceptions. And of course, tax policy can incentivize or disincentivize, behavior. But too often, we find people or organizations or groups of people who want a tax credit that might help us do something today without thinking about what the long-term implications of that are. So I think that's a really important part of, right now, the state of Colorado, the estimates are that that the state's going to have about $800 million more to spend in the fiscal year that they're budgeting for than they did last fiscal year. I've already counted 20 bills that are coming through the legislature that would give special tax treatment to some particular group of people.
Really?
Yeah. And many of them are for sympathetic groups of people.
Okay.
But we have to be careful when we think about giving away money when times are good, because times are going to change again. And let me give you an
example. When does that bill get reversed?
And nobody likes to take away a tax credit. That's a very nobody likes to raise anybody else's taxes.
That's going to burn a lot of hides, right?
We did this back in 1999 and 2000. The legislature chose to permanently reduce the income tax rate and the sales tax rate in the state of Colorado. Already had pretty low rates relative to other states, but we took. There was a decision made because we would have had to have given back Tabor rebates, so because the economy was productively growing beyond inflation plus population. So the legislature permanently reduced tax rates. Well, it's ironic to me that the amount of money that the state budget would have in it today, had we not cut taxes in 99 and 2000, would more than pay for many of the transportation enhancements that people are now trying to figure out how to finance. And that's what we need to think about when we think about winners and losers and sort of long-term tax policy over time.
When you say, picking winners and losers and maybe applying tax credits to, as you said, like sympathetic, can we say causes? Sympathetic, what? Give me an example, please.
Let me give you an example that I think is the most the biggest conundrum.
Okay.
In Colorado, we have not every state has this, but we still have something called a business personal property tax.
Okay.
So we assess property taxes on the personal, on the non-real estate assets of a business.
Oh, I've heard of this, yes.
And a lot of people argue, and I think quite persuasively, that biases against companies that manufacture things because they have a lot of.
So you're paying taxes on your supplies,
or the machinery and the equipment.
Oh, the machinery and equipment that's going to process and produce.
Exactly. And then you have a company that produces a product or a service that doesn't have many, doesn't have that same sort of intense property investments.
Right.
They don't pay as high a property taxes. That is picking winners and losers.
Oh, wow.
Right? Mm-hmm. Now, many of us believe that we should reform that tax policy. And one of the 25 bills that I talked about would be to exempt a higher threshold of property. The problem is, because our legislature doesn't have the authority to find that money someplace else, any tax cuts that we reduce, any break that we give, any leveling of that playing field comes out of paying for schools and higher education and transportation and child care and health care and the other important priorities of the state.
So it ends up being kind of a catch-22.
And again, I think there's a ton of agreement that that policy could be revised, but how do you do that in a way without additionally cutting additional services, which we already understand are underfunded?
Wow. How else is the state picking winners and losers in that vein?
I think that we see on a very regular basis. I mean, one way, and I think my organization thinks about it this way, we have our income tax system sounds like it is really terribly fair, right? Because it's a single rate.
Okay.
You pay, no matter how much income you have, an individual has, the tax rate is the state taxes are 4.63% of the federal taxable income. That sounds really fair, but when you actually start looking at how taxes are figured and who pays them, highest income folks in Colorado pay a smaller percentage of their income than the lowest income do, almost twice as much. Or lower income folks pay almost twice the share of their income in taxes than do higher income folks.
Okay.
And part of the reason that happens is what we choose to tax. So we don't tax any kinds of purchases of services in the state of Colorado. There's no sales tax on the purchase of services, but there is tax on the purchase of goods. So if you're purchasing a set of necessities, many of them are not service-based, they're goods-based.
Right.
And so your sales taxes fall more heavily on folks that have smaller income. Lower income folks have access to fewer of the kinds of tax breaks that higher income folks have. And so even our income tax system, this single rate income tax system, while it sounds like it would be the same for everybody, it ends up having the effect of sort of picking winners and losers in the contributions that we're all making toward our community.
Interesting. How any ideas how we fix it? How do we balance it out? The example you gave earlier, with the what word am I looking for? The
business personal property
tax? Personal property tax. I wrote it on the other piece of paper. You gave me that example, but are there other ways we can fix it?
Well, I think it's time for us. It's really time for the state of Colorado to take a serious look at our constitutional tax code. We wrote into voters approved some limitations and some constraints on property taxes back in the early '80s that we often refer to now as the Gallagher Amendment. And voters also adopted another part of our tax code that we often refer to as the Tabor Amendment back in 1992. And there's a lot of different opinions about whether Tabor and Gallagher are good or bad, or whether they've done good things or bad things in the past. But it seems to me that we're at a point where Colorado's economy is right on a new growing cusp. And the question is not whether these policies have served us well in the past. The real question is, do they set us up for the future?
Right.
And as the structure of businesses change over time, we really need to start to reconsider and think about together collectively whether or not these policies are the best thing going forward. I would suggest giving elected officials back some authority to make tax policy that can change with our economy would be a really important step in that direction. But
it sounds like some of those changes would then be really take some getting used to and take some time to balance out, wouldn't they? We're talking today with Carol Hedges. She's the Executive Director of Colorado Fiscal Institute. We're so happy to have you along for our conversations this week as we focus on tax and fiscal issues in the state. We will be right back with more Connect and Collaborate. Stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation with Carol when we come back. Thank you so much for staying with us here on Connect and Collaborate. This week we're focusing on, I moved my paper. We're focusing on tax and fiscal issues here in Colorado that impact business and certainly an impact on the national level. Today I'm talking with Carol Hedges. She's the Executive Director of Colorado Fiscal Institute, and I'm so glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a very interesting conversation. You know, a lot of people might look at, what you're doing or be reading your website at coloradofiscal.org and think that maybe you seem to think that the answer is raising taxes, that's the answer for everything. How do you view taxes' ability to build a strong economy?
It's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it because at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, we really do believe that taxes they are the path to prosperity.
Okay.
Because we listen to business partners who talk about that they need an educated workforce, and
yes.
they need a transportation system that moves people efficiently and effectively,
and moves
goods
products
and services
yeah.
efficiently and effectively. And that is not just roads, right? That's a system of transporting digital information
True.
as
okay,
well.
Okay, great point.
And so many of those things that we're talking about, education, transportation, digital communication, are things that really benefit from a collective and large investment. And when you think about what taxes actually do,
mm-hmm.
they actually take a little bit from everybody and then create benefit for everyone. And
that's what we want them to do.
It's an interesting. That's a really great way of thinking about it, because a lot of times people think about the taxes they pay and they don't immediately understand what it does for them.
Mm-hmm.
But communities don't really work that way. Communities, we're different. We have different needs, and there's a whole bunch of us. And so if we're going to have public investments that work for part of us, we need to have public investments that work for most of us.
Right.
And for us, it seems that the business community and the economy thrives best, and the market can work most efficiently when businesses can focus on what it is that they do, producing the goods and services that they are experts in. And so not having to worry about and spend too much time making sure that they've planned their transportation routes to avoid traffic snags,
right,
and that they don't have to invest a ton in re-educating their employees because the education system isn't producing the skills they need. That's a really efficient thing to do collectively. And we see that public sector investments are complements to private sector investments, and that they're the foundation upon which all private sector folks can benefit and hopefully can thrive, because that's what this is all about, is making sure that we have widespread economic prosperity.
Mm-hmm. And so you would like to see our legislatures and our lawmakers find ways to work on who's being taxed and how it's being taxed, and that can be more beneficial to everybody.
Well, that we can have a conversation among our elected officials
mm-hmm.
about what is the right level of the foundation that builds the strong economy. Right now, the elected officials don't have that ability. They don't have the authority to decide what the right size of our foundational investments are. They can't choose to increase the gasoline tax or the sales tax to build transportation, because we as elected as voters have taken that away from them.
Via Tabor, via
exactly.
Gallagher.
And so we elect people to do something that we've told them that they can't end up doing.
We want you to do it, but you can't, because
right. We've told you can't. It's a little circular.
I get it, because if you go ahead and if you could change Tabor, then you'd have all of a sudden here's a drastic change on this end and a drastic change on that end, which hopefully would even out, but everybody's going to feel unbalanced for a while.
Let me just give you an example that's going on right now. So the education system is by almost all standards underfunded. I've talked
sure.
about how
mm-hmm.
we're not keeping up with inflation. Our ability to invest in new technology is way down. We have a lot of novice teachers in our classrooms because we don't pay very well. There's just by a lot of measures. And there's big differentials between poor kids and rich kids and rural kids and urban kids, and there's just a lot of reasons for us to conclude that we're under-resourced. So the situation to get new resources is through the Tabor Amendment is to have citizens propose a tax increase. Now that sounds great. Well, all voters should be able to decide. Well, I am sure that there are people in our communities who can come together and figure out the right ways to tax people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard for them to get the voices of the entire state
Right.
to that table.
Exactly.
Because they're individuals, right? That we want them to, it's designed so that it has to be individuals. So we have a body, it's called the legislature,
Mm-hmm.
that represents folks from all across the state who are in the best position to be able to negotiate with one another, to best understand what various people from across the state need, but they don't have that authority.
Hmm.
So we wonder why it is that we have limitations in the tax proposals that we consider. It's because we built limitations into a system that says we're going to ask private citizens who don't have the financial wherewithal, the time,
Mm-hmm.
or even the expertise to sort of understand how tax policy is going to play out with everybody across the state.
Right.
That's where the ideas have to come from, and the financing then has to come from a group of people who are going to benefit most. The system, it doesn't make the most sense in terms of accomplishing support for the Colorado way of life that we all value.
How can we fix it?
Well, I think we can fix it by changing the Constitution.
Yeah.
Now that's a heavy lift,
Right. It is.
but it's something that we can come together to do. We can come together and do that when we start to realize that public investments actually do support the communities that we want to live in. When we identify the towns and the communities that we want to live in, it's usually they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
They have good schools. They have clean air and clean water. They have access to health care. There's parks around the corner. The sewer systems work, and so they drain the water when we have one of these big rain
Gully
systems.
washer.
And all of those things are things that we do collectively through a tax system.
Yeah.
And I think in Colorado and across the country, we've really gotten to the point where we see taxes as something bad,
Right.
as opposed to something that we all actually achieve benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the real heavy lift here, is to get people to understand that our collective investments really do benefit all of us. We forget often what these public investments, what they're doing to support the quality of life that we all want.
Right. Right. Moving on a little bit, let's talk about how we can at the state level. How do we protect the state level from those potentially negative or potentially harmful budget and tax decisions at the federal level? What are we looking at?
Well, we just had a major tax legislation passed by Congress, and in Colorado right now, whatever Congress did, those decisions pass automatically to our tax code. So whether we like what they did or whether we didn't like what they did, and whether we like the next tax change or we don't,
Right.
it automatically happens to us.
Okay.
So we need to be really careful. We need to, I think, in Colorado, need to think about what do we need here, not what the nation needs. And and our legislature needs to take a pretty serious look at our tax code. One of the things I think we need to do is have a comprehensive look at our tax code. We haven't done that. Like, how do our taxes compare to other states? How do we tax one business versus another, one individual versus another? Are there ways that we can tax new productivity and modernize our tax system? We haven't looked at that in a comprehensive way since 1959.
Really?
That's even longer ago than we raised the last time we invested more money in transportation.
Huh.
So I think that's one of the things that the legislature could do this year. It doesn't make any difference if they're the decision makers or if the citizens are decision makers. We all want the decisions to be made on good, up-to-date knowledge and information, and we just haven't been able to gather that for a long time. So I think that's one of the things that we can do.
Well, it sounds like a major undertaking.
Absolutely. It's a major undertaking. It would actually cost money.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's just invest a little bit of money and do that. It's a good time to do it. The economy is growing. It's expanding. Let's enlist some resources to help. Let's bring folks together to supervise. Let's ask people what they want to know. What are the answers to the questions that they need as decision makers? and go out and find those answers so that there is data out there. It's just it needs to be put together in a way that can really inform things. Colorado, like I said earlier, is on the cusp of some major changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us are here because we love this place.
Right.
And it is, our Colorado way of life is threatened right now. It's threatened by our inability to harness our the growth that we're experiencing and turning it, keeping it a positive experience for all of us. I think it's a really great time to take a little bit of this expansion and stop for a moment and think about where we want to go in the future.
Do you connect with our state legislators and representatives, and what's their feedback on these ideas?
Well, we do. The Colorado Fiscal Institute is a 501c3 organization, and we do some advocacy, and we do a lot of education. We go out and talk to a lot of folks. We have a lot of data, lots of charts. So we spend quite a bit of time working with our elected officials around these issues. I think that for the most part, all of our elected officials want the best for the state.
Mm-hmm.
I think that our legislature is like many of our political institutions these days, is really being pulled apart ideologically. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I've really found that there is a strong middle that's coming together of people who are saying, let's stop worrying about our allegiances to a political affiliation and let's align ourselves around our commitment to Colorado and the Colorado way of life. I think there are conservatives and there are liberals.
Right.
They're never going to agree on things. But I think that there is, like I said, a center forming of people who everybody understands that we need to solve the transportation, education, air quality, and water supply problems. And the only way we're going to do that is if we actually start to come together around that. And I think it's happening. A little hard to see right now in a legislative session where we're about to elect a new governor. Those kinds of things really get sort of intensify partisanship. But I think that many of the challenges that are created by this growing economy are bringing people together.
So you mentioned, kind of wishing that lawmakers could really look at all of the tax codes and find a way to maybe even it out. The opportunity to do a comprehensive tax study in Colorado to understand who pays what in our tax system and what the implications are for families and businesses. How do you target that and use that information to make decisions?
Well, I think that if we could, one of the things that seems to be dramatically missing in our political dialogue these days is a common set of facts. I am going to not remember who I should attribute this quote to, is that, everyone is entitled to their own conclusions, but we all need to, but there really is only one set of facts. So I think if we were to find, if we were to hire an organization, maybe one of our own higher education institutions, maybe a higher education institution someplace else in the country that has, particular expertise in this area, but to literally develop a set of questions that we as Coloradans think ought to be, that we want to know the answers to.
Right.
If we're going to make decisions about tax policy, who pays, how much, what are we incentivizing, what are we disincentivizing, how's that going to change in the future, how do other states do it? I think if we could bring that together and provide that as a manual for our decision makers to say, okay, here's a set of facts, and then let's all figure out whether we want to change the direction we're going or stay the course. But we all need to have sort of a common set of understanding. And I think that could happen relatively easily. I think that we have the problem that some people are benefiting now from the tax code, a political or economic benefit, and they're not really interested in getting those facts out there. I think they're a little worried that maybe if we share too much of that information, the changes will happen and they won't benefit as much. That's what is standing in the way of us getting sort of a common set of facts and data.
What what can we do next?
Well, I think the thing that we can do next, and the thing that, regardless of what our political affiliation is or how we identify on some spectrum of, conservative to liberal, is that we can do everything we can to be informed voters. And I don't mean just in terms of elected officials, because in Colorado, we as voters have a lot more responsibility than just electing folks.
Mm-hmm.
We are tax policy decision makers, and because of our initiative and referendum components of our Constitution, we're decision makers on a whole bunch of things.
Right.
So if we're going to do something, it's get smart about stuff.
Right. And so where can we as citizens and taxpayers and voters go to educate ourselves on what some of these decisions will really mean?
Well, I can't miss the opportunity to send people to
Of course.
the Colorado Fiscal Institute and the
Mhm.
work that we do. We are a like I said, a nonprofit 501c3 that provides all kinds of information about tax and budget. There are lots of folks out there that pay attention to these issues. I think there's some great work that's done by the Legislative Council. I think a very simple thing is, when you get your blue book, when it comes time
Mhm.
to election, read it and read the pros and cons and Google some questions.
Definitely. And you have to look outside the blue book too, don't you?
Absolutely, you have to look outside the blue book.
Because it can be explained in such a way that you need to find out more. And I like that you're saying the Colorado Fiscal Institute can be a good resource for that, and that's at coloradofiscal.org. And I'm looking at your website right now. You have a data library, a video library, a blog, and descriptions of the issues, so that you can really help people narrow down on what some of those things are going to mean.
Some of the, one of the things that I'm most proud of about our organization is that we've started to use video explanations. And so one of the big issues that a lot of people are struggling with now is this Gallagher thing. How do property taxes work?
Okay.
What is this all about?
Yeah.
We have a great video that in about 7 minutes, I know that's long.
It's a long time in our attention span.
I get it. But I don't even think it's 7. I think it's only a couple of minutes actually long. That will help. That's a pretty simple way of explaining it. And I lift that up because we've been working with some firefighters in the last legislative session when they were concerned about some property tax changes. We put this video together and we got thousands of shares. People sent back to us, "Thank you for finally putting this in a way that we can understand
Right.
it." And I think that that's something that is definitely a service that we'd like to provide to the community. And not only just our video, but also some of the reports that we write. We do a regular production or a regular email about what's happening in the federal level in terms of the federal tax bill as well as the federal budget discussion. So if people are interested, I'd love to have them sign up for our emails, and they can do that at coloradofiscal.org.
That's great. So you can sign up for emails. And as you mentioned, those videos, I can imagine, I can picture it. It's such a great way to be able to share those on social media when, if you're passionate about a certain ballot issue that, like you said, you're looking at the blue book, find a little more information. I'm sure, Carol, you wouldn't oppose people sharing all of those on Facebook or wherever.
Absolutely not. And if people have ideas about other things that are confusing to them in this tax and budget policy world, drop us an email and let us know, and we will put that in the queue of things that we're working on, because our value is helping people understand these complex tax and budget items.
Yeah.
And we may not all agree on what the solution is, right? And that's okay. But what we're trying to do is explain the problems and the issues in a way that people can understand.
Yes, because if you can educate yourself on how, this particular tax impacts you, either as a homeowner or as a citizen or in any way, shape, or form, you can then make the better decisions.
And it's important to remember that taxes are, of course, they impact you in terms of meaning that you have less money in your paycheck,
Yes.
but they also provide you with a benefit. My husband and I lived for about 3 years in the in West Africa.
Really?
And there were many wonderful things about that experience in terms of appreciating the life here in America and what we have. But one of the things that was so clear to me is that we forget about what the public sector does for us. We lived in a very modern home. We had we had lived in a completely modern home, but we couldn't drink the water because the sewage, the water systems weren't fully contained.
Right.
And so they were contaminated.
So you never knew if something,
right.
A contaminant was going to leach in. And,
right.
Yeah.
And it was because they weren't regularly inspected, and because they weren't required to be built out of, made out of certain kinds of materials. And so we always had a distiller. We drank all of our drinking water was run through a distiller. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't happen in the United States.
Right.
I mean, there's occasionally a breach, and we saw it in Flint and a few things like that. But those are the kinds of invisible things that our tax dollars do for us.
Right.
That people don't think about. Who thinks about when they go to their tap that the reason it is separate and protected from contaminants is because there is a public investment to make sure that it's built out of the right thing and that those systems are maintained. And that's the other side of that. We can understand what giving that dollar away means in terms of what I can't buy, but what we need to open our minds to is what we actually get from those investments.
Right. So it's not just how the taxes might impact you financially, but what is the benefit? Who's going to benefit? Do you benefit from it, or are you helping students benefit?
And then what does that mean to you if your employees are better educated? It is we're all in this together. And that's something that it's sometimes hard for all of us to remember, that this isn't simply a matter of us living on our own island, that we do connect with one another. And then in Colorado, those of us who live on the Front Range also have connections with folks that live in rural agricultural areas or in the resort areas, like where we like to spend our weekends.
We easily forget that, don't we?
Well, you know what?
That we're sharing the state with people who are different from us in where they live, what they produce.
And what if we think about it? I mean, when I go to the mountains to enjoy that climate and that experience, the part of the reason I have a good experience is because people there can live there and have good schools and good places for them to deliver babies and get health care but we don't think about those things. But that's what makes our experience of the mountain terrific, is that there's a little community there that we all love. Well, they have the same needs that we do here in the metro area. They just look and feel a little different. And I just really would, I think that it's the same connection between the public and private sector working together to make this a great place where we can all live. Employees, owners of businesses, workers, contractors, everybody, because we're really privileged to live in this incredible place.
We are. And Carol, I thank you so much for that perspective. We do look at it, we all feel like, oh, taxes are bad. Nobody wants taxes raised. But it's what makes our society work.
It is, and in Colorado,
to boil it down.
In Colorado, we pay, we don't pay, our tax rates are really low compared to so many other places, and I would suggest we have such incredible things to protect. I thought it was interesting this morning, there was some analysis that many of us feel, I think it was 75% of Coloradans identify themselves as conservationists. We feel responsible for this place.
Right.
And the way we can protect it is by doing our own part individually, taking personal responsibility, but also taking personal responsibility for investing in our collective communities as well.
Thank you so much, Carol Hedges, Executive Director of Colorado Fiscal Institute, for sharing your perspective with us, really giving us some great information on why our taxes are what they are and maybe what we can do to make some important changes.
Thank you. It was really a wonderful opportunity.
Well, we appreciate it. And thank you for listening. We are focusing on tax and fiscal issues this week here on Connect and Collaborate. We're so glad you're listening, and have a great afternoon.